In 1983, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel sat down to write a report the CIA had commissioned. His name was Wayne McDonnell. His assignment was to evaluate a consciousness training program being run out of a research institute in rural Virginia. The report he produced is one of the strangest documents the United States government has ever declassified. It concludes in official military and intelligence language that human consciousness can be trained to operate outside the boundaries of time and space, that the practitioner can encounter what the document calls intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms, that the framework rests on a model of the universe as a hologram and of consciousness as an energy pattern capable of persisting beyond physical death. That document is real. You can find it at the CIA's public reading room right now. 28 pages, declassified in 2003, read by millions of people. But what most of those people don't know, what the widespread coverage of this document consistently gets wrong, is this. It is not just page 25 that is missing. Page 24 ends mid-sentence, not at the end of a paragraph, not at the end of a section, mid-sentence, inside section 34. Page 26 opens at section 37. 2 full sections of a classified U.S. government report on human consciousness have been removed. Not redacted, removed. The gap is larger and more deliberate than anyone has reported. And for over 20 years, everyone was asking the CIA for those sections. Nobody thought to ask the people whose work the CIA was actually studying. It is 1983. The Cold War is not winding down. It is at one of its most dangerous points in a decade. The Soviet Union has just shot down a Korean civilian airliner. Reagan has called it an evil empire. U.S. and Soviet forces are at their highest state of readiness in years. Inside U.S. Army intelligence, a lieutenant colonel named Wayne McDonnell receives an unusual assignment. McDonnell is not a mystic. He is a career military officer with the Army Intelligence and Security Command. His assignment comes at the direct request of the CIA. He is to travel to a research institute in rural Virginia, a place called the Monroe Institute, and produce a comprehensive analytical assessment of their work. The question he is being asked to answer is this: does what they are doing actually work? And if it does, what is it doing? The Monroe Institute sits on 700 acres in Faber, Virginia, a small town in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. From the outside, it looks like a retreat center. What happens inside is considerably more unusual. The Institute was founded by a man named Robert Monroe, and Monroe's story begins not with mysticism, but with a boardroom. In the 1950s, Monroe was a successful radio broadcasting executive in New York. He had built a production company. He had a reputation. He had no particular interest in consciousness research, meditation, or anything adjacent to what would come to define his life. Then in 1958, something began happening to him involuntarily. Without warning, without intention, without any spiritual practice or substance to explain it, Monroe began leaving his body. Not metaphorically. He would find his awareness operating at a distance from his physical form, looking down at himself, moving through walls, perceiving locations he had no physical access to. He was terrified. He went to doctors. He underwent neurological evaluation. Nothing explained it. What Monroe did next is the thing that matters. Instead of suppressing the experiences or pathologizing them, he approached them in the way a broadcasting engineer approaches an unfamiliar signal. He began systematically investigating them, documenting them, testing them, eventually reproducing them in others. His 1971 book, Journeys Out of the Body, was the first serious, systematic account of out-of-body experiences written from the inside. It brought him to the attention of researchers who had been circling the same territory from very different directions. One of those researchers was Itzhak Bentov. Bentov was an Israeli-American inventor and biomedical engineer, a man who held patents in cardiac catheter technology and who had also, separately, developed a highly detailed model of how consciousness interacts with the physical body. His 1977 book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, laid out the mechanics, how the body's own rhythms under specific conditions could fall into resonance with larger fields. Consciousness in those states behaved in ways that standard neuroscience had no framework to describe. Bentov died in 1979. He did not live to see what his work would produce. When Wayne McDonnell sat down to write his report, he stated his goal plainly in the opening pages. He wanted to construct what he called a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions. His specific aim was to put out-of-body states into the language of physical science, to remove what he called the stigma of their occult connotations. He leaned heavily on Bentov's biomedical models to do it, and on 4 years of direct engagement with Monroe's research team. What he produced is not what anyone expected a classified military intelligence document to contain. McDonnell's report runs to 28 pages. It is dense, it is technical, and it is written in the measured, unsentimental language of military intelligence analysis, which makes what it actually argues considerably more disorienting than if it had been written by a mystic. To understand what the CIA commissioned and what McDonnell produced, you need to follow the document's own logic from the beginning. The Monroe Institute's core technology is called hemisync, hemispheric synchronization. The principle is straightforward. If you play a tone of 200 cycles per second into one ear and a tone of 210 cycles per second into the other, the brain does not hear two separate tones. It perceives the difference between them, a third tone of 10 cycles per second that does not exist in the room. The brain generates it internally to reconcile the discrepancy. That internally generated tone is called a binaural beat, and the brain does not merely perceive it, it entrains to it. The electrical activity of both hemispheres begins synchronizing around that frequency. Monroe spent years mapping what happens at different frequencies, at specific ranges. Specific and reproducible states of consciousness reliably emerge. Deep relaxation, expanded awareness, states in which the ordinary boundaries of self and environment begin to dissolve. The Monroe Institute built a curriculum around this, a structured progression of audio exercises moving through increasingly deep states. They called it the Gateway Experience. McDonnell assessed this technology with the same rigor he would bring to any military evaluation, and he needed a framework to explain what was producing the results Monroe's participants were reporting. He found that framework in Itzhak Bentov's biomedical research. Bentov had identified something unusual in the physiology of deep meditative states. When the body becomes sufficiently still and the breath is held or deeply slowed, the rhythmic pressure pulse of the heartbeat travels down the aorta, the body's central artery, and rebounds off the point where it divides. That echo travels back up and falls into synchrony with the next heartbeat at approximately 7 cycles per second. 7 cycles per second corresponds to the alpha rhythm of the brain. At that frequency, in that state, the body's own rhythms fall into a kind of internal coherence that Bentov's model suggested had measurable effects extending beyond the body itself. McDonnell used this as the physiological foundation for his analysis. The gateway experience in his reading was not producing altered states through suggestion or placebo. It was producing a specific, reproducible physiological condition, and in that condition, consciousness was doing something that conventional neuroscience had no framework to describe. To describe what consciousness was doing, McDonnell needed a model of reality itself. He chose the holographic universe framework. The proposition, developed by physicist David Bohm, among others, that the universe is not a collection of separate objects, but an undivided whole, and that every part of it contains the information of the whole. In a hologram, if you cut the plate in half, you do not get half the image. You get the whole image at lower resolution. The information is distributed. Every part encodes the entirety. McDonald argues that consciousness in the holographic model is not produced by the brain. It is a pattern of energy, structured, coherent, and capable of interacting with the larger holographic field in which it exists. The brain, in this reading, is an instrument that tunes to consciousness rather than a generator that creates it. This has a specific implication that McDonald states directly. The gateway experience, McDonald concludes, is a training system designed to move consciousness progressively outside its ordinary orientation. He maps the progression in structured levels. At the early levels, the body enters deep relaxation while the mind remains fully alert. At the next level, awareness begins to expand beyond ordinary perceptual boundaries. Participants report the sense that consciousness is larger than the physical form containing it. At the deeper levels, something more fundamental shifts. Linear time becomes less relevant. The ordinary frame in which past, present, and future are experienced as sequential begins to loosen. McDonald describes this not as hallucination or fantasy, but as a change in the operating parameters of consciousness itself, a movement toward what the document calls the larger reality. Near the end of the report, McDonald states his overall conclusion plainly. The gateway experience is a training system designed to bring about an altered state of consciousness in which a practitioner is able to escape even the restrictions of time and space. That sentence is in a declassified U.S. military intelligence document commissioned by the CIA, written by a career Army officer in 1983. McDonald does not stop there. In his operational assessment, he notes that if the military were to experiment with the gateway experience as an intelligence tool, personnel should be, in his words, intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. Non-corporeal energy forms. A classified CIA document is warning that personnel who successfully learn to operate outside time and space may encounter entities that also exist outside time and space, and that the military should have a protocol for that encounter. This is not the fringe. This is not speculation. This is the conclusion of a formal, analytical report produced for the Central Intelligence Agency by the United States Army, and the sections that follow that conclusion, the sections that described the territory beyond the time-space threshold in full, are the sections that were removed. By the bottom of page 24, McDonald has built his full theoretical case. The holographic universe, consciousness as a coherent energy pattern, the gateway experience as a systematic method for moving that pattern beyond its ordinary operating parameters. The document has a momentum. A reader can feel where it is headed, and then it stops. Page 24 ends mid-sentence, not at the end of a paragraph, not at the end of a section, mid-sentence inside section 34. Page 26 opens at section 37. Sections 35 and 36 are gone. The remainder of section 34 is gone. The internal numbering of the document is itself the proof. A section that begins on page 24 cannot resume on page 26 without something in between. Since 2003, every Freedom of Information Act request filed for those sections has received the same response. Not, it is classified, not, it is withheld. The CIA's position is that the missing content never existed. A section that begins cannot not exist. The claim is structurally impossible. For over 20 years, everyone directed their requests to the CIA. Researchers, journalists, transparency advocates, every avenue led to the same dead end. What none of them considered, what seems almost too simple in retrospect, is that the CIA did not produce this document alone. McDonald spent time at the Monroe Institute. He worked with their researchers. He evaluated their program in direct engagement with people running it. And the Monroe Institute kept a copy. In February 2021, a journalist named Phoebe Campion published a breakdown of the Gateway Process report for Vice's technology desk. It was not the first time the document had been covered, but something about the timing caught. The article went widely read, comments piled up, emails arrived. 4 days after publication, the Monroe Institute reached out. They had ideas for a follow-up piece, they said. The journalist was buried in responses and let the email go. The Monroe Institute reached out again. This time the message was more concrete. Sitting in the Monroe Institute's physical archives in Faber, Virginia, described later as having been in a barn, unexamined, was the missing content from the Gateway Process report. They had always had it. Nobody had ever asked them. People had been filing FOIA requests with the Central Intelligence Agency for 18 years. Researchers, journalists, transparency advocates, curious readers, all of them directed their requests to Langley. All of them received the same response. None of them had thought to contact the organization whose work the CIA had been analyzing. The people who were in the room when McDonald wrote his assessment, the people who provided the material he studied. The Monroe Institute had the original document the entire time. The release did not come easily or quickly. The Monroe Institute's initial call included their CEO, their COO, and their marketing division. There were discussions about timing and strategy. Then the organization went through a significant leadership change. The CEO and COO departed. And one evening, the director of marketing sent an email. It contained the full Gateway Process report, including the missing sections. She was candid afterward about why it had taken so long. The missing content, she explained, deals with religious territory, specifically with the idea that all spiritual traditions, at their deepest level, are pointing at the same thing. She reflected that if it had been released 20 years earlier, the cultural reaction might have been very different. The restored page opens with a single sentence. A classified United States military intelligence document commissioned by the CIA concludes that the entire arc of consciousness development, the territory beyond the time-space threshold that the Gateway experience is designed to access, is a movement toward union with the Absolute. That is what was in the missing sections. That is what the CIA removed from the declassified document, and that is why they told anyone who asked it had never existed. The Monroe Institute's marketing director was right about one thing. The content is not operationally sensitive. It does not reveal intelligence sources. It does not compromise national security. It does not contain anything a foreign adversary could use. What it contains is the conclusion that the destination of human consciousness, the territory a trained practitioner can reach by moving beyond the boundaries of time and space, is union with the Absolute, and that every spiritual tradition on Earth has been describing that same destination in its own language for thousands of years. The complete document, including the restored sections, is linked in the description below. In 1983, a career U.S. Army officer sat down to write a report for the Central Intelligence Agency. He concluded that human consciousness can be trained to operate outside the boundaries of time and space, that the framework for doing so rests on a model of the universe as a hologram and of consciousness as an energy pattern that does not require a physical body to exist. He then wrote the sections that described what lies beyond that threshold, and those sections were removed from the document before it was released to the public. The CIA's position, maintained for over 20 years in response to every request ever filed, is that those sections never existed. A section that begins cannot not exist. The content was eventually recovered, not from the CIA, from the people whose work McDonald was studying. It had been in a barn in rural Virginia the entire time. What it contains is not operational methodology. It is not classified tradecraft. It does not compromise national security in any way that can be reasonably argued. It opens with the assertion that the entire arc of time-space, the whole of what we call reality, is a process of moving toward union with the absolute, and that every spiritual tradition on earth has been describing that same destination in its own language for thousands of years. That is what the CIA removed. That is what they said never existed. The question worth sitting with is not why they removed it. The question is what it means that they were studying it at all. A government does not commission a classified analysis of consciousness training unless it believes the territory is real. McDonald's report is not the work of a man who thought he was studying delusion. The CIA did not file this document away because they found nothing. They filed it away because they found something, and then decided how much of what they found the public should see. If that territory is real enough that governments have spent decades studying how to assess it, the question that follows is older than any of those governments. Who knew about it first, and how? Every source referenced in this episode is linked in the description below, including the closest thing that currently exists to the complete document. Start there. That question belongs to another episode. What comes next is closer in time and considerably more disturbing. While Wayne McDonald was studying what human consciousness could achieve, the Soviet Union had already spent a decade and $1 billion trying to turn that same field into a weapon. That is where we are going.